Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a piece of history that honestly feels almost too dramatic to be true. We're looking at a conflict that absolutely shocked the modern world. It's the story of an unbreakable mountain people and the truly staggering lengths an empire will go to just to maintain control. I want you to picture this. It's January 1995. The city of Grozny, which used to be one of the most beautiful and prosperous cities in the entire Soviet Union, has been turned into a literal hellscape. I mean, the sky's just shaking with the roar of Russian fighter jets and relentless artillery fire. But down in the streets, right among the skeletal remains of these massive apartment blocks, something unimaginable is happening. Russian tanks and armored vehicles are burning. The mighty Russian army, long feared as this unstoppable global superpower, is completely trapped in a concrete graveyard, facing off against an incredibly fierce rebel force. It was the ultimate modern-day David versus Goliath. So, you gotta wonder, how exactly did a tiny, rugged region in the Caucasus Mountains manage to humiliate the military machine of a nuclear superpower? What is it about the Chechen people that let them resist the world's most powerful empires century after century? Well, to figure out this incredible military upset, we need to take a step back.
Part 1. Roots of the Resistance.
To really understand this resistance, we have to look at the cultural DNA of the Chechen people, who call themselves the Nakchi. You see, for centuries, their unforgiving mountain terrain physically shaped this fiercely independent character. The absolute bedrock of their society is the tape. That's their traditional clan system. And here's the thing. For Chechen, loyalty to the clan comes before absolutely everything else, especially the state. It creates this profound, unbreakable brotherhood. So for a culture that values bravery, honor, and freedom literally above life itself, this clan system acted like an incredible natural defense against any outside empire trying to come in and dictate how they should live. Naturally, this fiercely independent spirit was bound to clash with Russia. Back in the 18th and 19th centuries, czars like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great wanted to expand south. But they hit a massive brick wall, the mountain tribes of the Caucasus. From 1817 to 1859, a highly charismatic military leader named Imam Shamil led a brutal 25-year guerrilla war against these massive czar armies. Imam Shamil eventually had to surrender, and by 1864, Russia formally conquered the region. But remember that unbroken spirit we talked about? Russia might have claimed the land, but they never broke the Chechen desire for independence. Really, all this war did was plant the deepest seeds of mistrust and generational hatred toward Moscow. Part 2. The Soviet Trauma. When the Russian Revolution hit in 1917, the Chechens initially had some real hope for freedom. But the Bolsheviks ended up brutally suppressing their Islamic faith. And this oppression culminated in one staggering, horrifying figure. 500,000. 500,000 people. This number represents the absolute darkest, most traumatic chapter in Chechen history, an event that basically guaranteed permanent hostility toward Moscow. Here's what happened. On February 23, 1944, Joseph Stalin ordered Operation Lentil, which the Chechens call the Ardadek. Stalin completely falsely accused the entire Chechen and neighboring English populations of collaborating with Nazi Germany. Soviet secret police just surrounded their villages. Families were given exactly 20 minutes at gunpoint to pack up their entire lives. They were then shoved into freezing, unheated cattle train wagons like livestock and exiled thousands of miles away to the icy steppes of Kazakhstan and Siberia. The cruelty here was just unimaginable. Between a quarter and a third of the population died from the cold, starvation, and disease. It was ethnic cleansing, plain and simple. And get this, even when they were finally allowed back after Stalin died in 1957, they found Russians living in their homes. So this immense, irreversible trauma, that became the lens through which every single future Chechen generation would view Russian rule. Which brings us to Part 3, the First War, 1994 to 1996. Fast forward to 1991, the Soviet Union is collapsing and Chechnya declares independence. Now, Russian President Boris Yeltsin is terrified of a domino effect, so he launches a military invasion in 1994, fully expecting a quick, easy victory. The Russian defense minister even boasted they'd take Grozny in a matter of hours, but that overconfidence completely unraveled. The Russian military sent inexperienced, highly unmotivated troops in these heavily armored columns straight into the city center, which turned out to be a suicidal tactic. On the flip side, the Chechen fighters, many of whom were actually Soviet army veterans themselves, were highly motivated. They hid in basements and on rooftops, just raining RPGs down onto the trapped Russian tanks. That New Year's Eve assault, it turned into an absolute slaughter for the Russian forces.
What followed was a horrific 21-month stalemate, defined by extreme brutality from both sides. Russian forces resorted to indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas and set up these terrifying filtration camps that were full of torture and extrajudicial killings. On the other side, Chechen commanders like Shamil Basayev resorted to outright terrorism, famously taking hundreds of civilians hostage in a Russian hospital in 1995. Finally, in August 1996, Chechen fighters audaciously retook Grozny. Russia was forced into a super humiliating withdrawal under the Khasevyar Accord. The Chechens had technically won de facto independence, but man, the cost was terrifying. Up to 100,000 lives lost in a nation that was completely destroyed.
Part 4. Chaos and Radicalization. The real tragedy of this hard-fought victory was that it didn't bring any peace. Between 1996 and 1999, Chechnya's totally ruined economy led to rampant crime, kidnappings, and warlord rule. And during this lawless period, a massive ideological fracture split the country right down the middle. On one hand, you had the traditional secular nationalists, led by elected President Aslan Maskhadov. They really just wanted a normal, independent, secular state. But rising up against them were radical Islamists. Foreign jihadists flush with cash, like the Saudi fighter Kadyrov, joined forces with local commanders like Basayev. They started pushing this global jihadist ideology. They didn't just want Chechen independence anymore. They wanted to establish a massive Islamic emirate across the entire northern Caucasus. Essentially, this radical faction hijacks the original nationalist movement from the inside out.
Part 5. Putin's Second War.
That internal ideological hijacking gave Moscow the absolute perfect opening. In August 1999, radical factions led by Basayev and Kadyrov crossed the border to invade neighboring Dagestan, hoping to spark a wider rebellion. For Russia, that was the last straw. Then, in September, a series of mysterious apartment bombings in Russian cities killed around 300 civilians. Now, the Russian government immediately blamed Chechen terrorists, but it's really important to note here that many critics strongly suspect the Russian Secret Service, the FSB, actually orchestrated this as a false flag operation. Regardless of who actually planted those bombs, Russia's newly appointed Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin, capitalized on the massive public outrage. He launched a massive, utterly devastating anti-terrorist invasion in October 1999. By February 2000, after literally leveling whatever was left of Grozny with artillery, the Russians retook control. But Putin knew that military force alone wasn't going to cut it. I mean, the czars had already tried that, right? So he introduced a highly calculated yet incredibly ruthless political strategy called Chechenization. The concept was pretty simple: use Chechens to control Chechens. Putin found local leaders who feared the radical extremist way more than they hated Moscow. He aligned with a man named Kadyrov. Now, Kadyrov was the former chief mufti of Chechnya and had actually fought against Russia in the First War. But Kadyrov flipped sides, and Putin made him the head of a pro-Russian administration. His militia, known as the Kadyrovtsis, essentially took over the dirty job of violently hunting down and eliminating the remaining separatists. Putin somehow managed to turn a war of independence into a brutal, internal Chechen civil war.
Part 6. The Price of Peace.
After Akhmat Kadyrov was assassinated in 2004, Putin installed his son, Ramzan Kadyrov. And that leads us to the deeply jarring paradox of modern-day Chechnya. If you were to visit Grozny right now, you wouldn't see rubble. Not at all. You'd see this gleaming facade of glass towers, luxurious malls, and massive mosques, all funded by billions in Moscow money. But right behind that facade, it is a terrifying personal fiefdom. Ramzan Kadyrov's security forces operate with total impunity. There are widespread documented reports of extrajudicial killings, disappearances, and the torture of anyone who breathes even a word of criticism. On top of that, Kadyrov enforces his own incredibly strict state-sponsored version of Islam, dictating dress codes and daily life in ways that often outright defy Russian federal law. This whole ecosystem rests on an incredibly delicate trade-off: the Putin-Kadyrov Pact. Moscow provides basically infinite money and completely turns a blind eye to how Kadyrov runs the region. In exchange, Kadyrov brutally crushes any hint of Chechen separatism and offers absolute, unconditional loyalty to Vladimir Putin. Kadyrov proudly calls himself Putin's foot soldier, and he'll immediately send his own forces into conflicts, like the war in Ukraine, whenever Moscow demands it. So while Chechnya is officially part of Russia, it effectively operates entirely under Kadyrov's personal rules. It's a peace built on total suppression, not democracy. Which leaves us with this final, really profound question. Today, the streets of Chechnya are quiet. But is this modern stability a genuine, lasting peace? Or, beneath those shiny glass towers and the shadow of autocracy, is this just a dormant volcano waiting for its next explosion? The Chechen desire for freedom has survived empires, it survived the czars, and it survived Stalin. Whether it can survive this new era of internal iron-fisted control remains one of the most fascinating geopolitical questions of our time. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.